Please join me in welcoming Michael Smerconish.
Thank you, Sean, for that introduction. Sean was extremely kind in leaving out some of my more recent credentials. So, in the essence of full disclosure, let me share them with you now. I didn't think that Donald Trump would ever run for president. I doubted that he would fill out any financial disclosures. I was sure that those comments that he made about John McCain as a POW would sink him like a stone. I thought that every primary and caucus election victory would be his last. I thought that his desire to build a wall on our southern border would crush him with Hispanic voters. I thought that the Billy Bush tape would ruin him with females, that his debate performances would finish him off, and yes, I actually said that Hillary would win with somewhere between 325 and 350 electoral votes. And each of my predictions was noted by a very loyal viewer.
The facts are the facts.
Let's see how many people actually correct the record now. Today.
Maybe none, but,
yeah.
but these are really dishonest people. I mean, Huffington Post is like pathetic. You have some guy named Smerconish who I never even heard of. He goes...
And yet, in this political climate, I am still what passes for a pundit. And not just any pundit. A pundit who was welcomed as a panelist on CNN for every primary and caucus election night. I did both party conventions, all 4 debates if you include the vice presidential debate, and a 9-hour tour of duty on election night with Anderson Cooper as part of the final panel. Now, obviously, I had a lot of company among those who missed the Trump train. But in all seriousness, I'm the one who should have seen it coming, because I had a front row seat. To understand the result of the 2016 election, I think you need to go back 30 years. So let me present what just happened, at least through my lens. I graduated, as Sean mentioned, from the University of Pennsylvania Law School in 1987. And by 1987, I'd already been politically active. I had met Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush in my senior year of high school at Central Bucks West in Doylestown, when I had just registered to vote, and meeting each of them within a 5-day time period gave me a real dilemma as to who I would cast my first Republican primary vote for. But each of them left me enthused about the GOP ticket. So I went off to Lehigh University, where I quickly formed a club that I called Lehigh University Youth for Reagan Bush, mistakenly thinking that others on campus would share my enthusiasm for Republican politics. George Bush, whose title was then Ambassador Bush, made an 11th-hour visit to the Bethlehem Steel plant. And as the president of the club, believe it or not, in my freshman dorm, no internet, no cell phones, just one hall phone in Taylor House for 150 guys. But through, I guess, divine intervention, I received a telephone message to call someone on the vice president's staff. It turned out they needed motorcade car drivers, if you can imagine this in a pre-9/11 world. And they wanted to know if the members of my club would drive the motorcade cars for the future vice president. The visit went well to Bethlehem Steel, and I was then recruited to do advance work for Vice President George Bush, which meant that while still in college, I traveled the country and even around the globe planning the logistics of some of his personal appearances. And then in my second year of law school at Penn, I ran unsuccessfully for the Pennsylvania State Legislature. I like to say that I lost by 419 votes, and I have since located 237 of those people. In my final year of law school at Penn, I spent the fall working to get Arlen Specter elected to the United States Senate, and then in the spring helping Frank Rizzo win a mayoral primary as a newly minted Republican. And from those early political experiences, I then received invitations to appear initially on radio as someone who could offer election night commentary. I didn't know it at the time, but it was the start of a career. Now, meanwhile, in Manhattan, at about the time that I was graduating from law school, a real estate developer was becoming ubiquitous. Donald Trump had taken over the family business, the Trump Organization as we now know it, in 1971, and he made some big deals. When the Pennsylvania Central Railroad declared bankruptcy, Trump was wise in getting an option on the rail yards on the Upper West Side and then convincing New York City that this should be the home of their next convention center, which today we know as the Javits Center. He similarly obtained an option on a Penn Central hotel near Grand Central Station, and it was then christened the Grand Hyatt. Hyatt didn't have a flag in Midtown Manhattan. In 1979, Donald Trump leased space next door to Tiffany, built what we now know as the Trump Tower. He then entered Atlantic City, where he became the owner of what was then the largest hotel casino in the world, the Taj Mahal. And in 1985, he purchased Mar-a-Lago in Florida. The year that I graduated from law school, 1987, Donald Trump wrote what would become his second favorite book when he released The Art of the Deal. He was still married to Ivana. They had 3 children, Don Jr., Ivanka, and Eric. And it was at this time that he made his first trip to New Hampshire. He was invited by a GOP activist, a guy by the name of Mike Dunbar. He spoke to the Portsmouth, New Hampshire Rotary Club. The event was October 22nd at Yokin's Restaurant. Thar she blows. And by all accounts, Donald Trump, in October of 1987, wowed that standing room only crowd. As a result, immediately came the speculation that he, Trump, would run for president that cycle, which was 1988. That, of course, never happened. And for the next 27 years, Donald Trump returned 6 times to New Hampshire, each time coinciding with a presidential election and each time generating nationwide coverage as to whether Trump would really run for president. As a matter of fact, it became a bit of a running joke. In BuzzFeed, McKay Coppins went back last year at a time when he too didn't think Trump would run and painstakingly documented each of the near misses of Trump getting into the campaign. It was a different political world when Donald Trump first went to New Hampshire. We were nearing the end of Ronald Reagan's second term, and Washington was a different place in the 1980s. Collegiality was still common. As a matter of fact, when Reagan won the election in 1980, within 2 weeks of being elected, before he was even inaugurated, he paid a courtesy call on Tip O'Neill, who was then the Speaker of the House. O'Neill told Reagan that they would often disagree during the day, but they'd always be friends past 6 p.m. and on weekends. Ronald Reagan made Tip O'Neill among his first dinner guests at the White House, and it was O'Neill who would kneel beside Ronald Reagan's hospital bed after Reagan had been shot by John Hinckley, and together the men would recite the 23rd Psalm. In 1981, Ronald Reagan hosted Tip O'Neill at the White House for what was O'Neill's 69th birthday, and he proposed an Irish toast to Tip O'Neill. He said, "Tip, if I had a ticket to heaven and you didn't have one too, I'd throw mine away and go to hell with you." That camaraderie lasted until Tip O'Neill retired, and when he retired, it was President Ronald Reagan who was the headliner for the retiring Democratic House Speaker. There was partisanship, but there wasn't polarization, not yet. As a matter of fact, the National Journal began in the 80s taking the pulse of every member of the House and Senate. They would identify about 100 votes each year, votes where you could easily discern a conservative and a liberal point of view. And they would then do a calculation, and they would determine how many conservatives are there, how many liberals are there, how many moderates are there in both the House and the Senate. According to the National Journal, on Ronald Reagan's watch, 60% of the Senate was comprised of moderates. There were so many moderates in the United States Senate on Reagan's watch that the Republican moderates had their own gathering. They called it the Wednesday Lunch Club. And the members of the Wednesday Lunch Club included Senators Hines and Specter from Pennsylvania, Bob Dole, Nancy Kassebaum, Ted Stevens, Bob Packwood, Alan Simpson. Today, all gone. And I don't mean gone through attrition, I mean gone and not having been replaced by any moderates. The media climate on Ronald Reagan's watch, the same time when Donald Trump first dipped his toe into the political water, was also significantly different than it is today. Television consisted of the big three networks. There was no cable. It was the age of anchors: Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather. Radio was terrestrial only, no satellite radio yet. Al Gore had yet to invent the internet. And it was at this time, you're not sure if I'm serious or not, right? When I say that, I'll just keep moving. It was at this time that I first began making regular radio appearances, 1990 in particular, on a Philadelphia radio station called 96.5 FM WWDB, the talk station. It was a 50,000-watt flamethrower. It was owned by a local couple, Chuck and Susan Schwartz. She, as a matter of fact, signed my first paycheck for $85.29. I was then appointed in 1992 by a now President, George Herbert Walker Bush, for whom I'd once carried his bags, literally, to a sub-cabinet position where I was responsible for all federal housing in 5 states plus Washington, D.C. And from that position came invitations beyond radio now, but in the realm of television, to provide election analysis. In the radio world, I went from being a guest to a guest host to the host of my own weekend program. And here's the point. In that era, conversation was key. Personality mattered, not ideology. Could you sustain a conversation with callers to your program was the litmus test for whether you were viewed as a success. And the radio station lineup here in Philadelphia was then typical of what you found at radio stations, talk radio stations all across the country. Frank Ford was a part of the lineup. He was an unabashed liberal, married to Lynn Abraham, who was the long-term district attorney here in Philadelphia. Irv Homer, Evil Irv, was a libertarian before the rest of us had ever heard of Ron Paul, much less Rand Paul. Susan Bray had a husky voice, and she was from Australia. Her moniker was the Saucy Aussie. Dominic Quinn was a conservative, but he was really best known for his command of the English language. And the person I most often think about now from that era, because I used to guest host for him, was Bernie Herman. His brand, his moniker, his shtick was the gentleman of broadcasting, and he would host a program from 10 p.m. until 1 a.m. And I often think today, if you were a young man or a young woman and you wanted to get into the radio or the cable television business, and you had a meeting with a program director and they said, well, what's your program going to be about? And you said, well, I'm the gentleman of broadcasting. You're not crossing the threshold. You're not getting that gig. And then the media landscape shifted. Not long after my radio debut, not long after Donald Trump went to Yoakum's in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, everything changed. It happened at the time of the first Gulf War, when a radio host in Sacramento was having great success talking conservative politics. Rush Limbaugh had established a clubhouse for conservatives. He'd rolled out the welcome mat in a way that had never been tried before, and he filled a conservative void. And soon every radio station, talk radio station in the country, wanted to have Limbaugh and wanted to have a stable of his imitators. The Philadelphia radio station where I worked was the last big city radio station to take Rush Limbaugh in their lineup. He was a success, and others took note. Fox News came online in 1996 and took a page from the talk playbook. 6 years later, Fox overtook CNN as the cable station that had the highest viewership. The Drudge Report reached its zenith in 1998 by breaking the Lewinsky scandal. MSNBC struggled to find its sea legs until they turned Keith Olbermann loose in 2003 to do diatribes against President George W. Bush. In 2005, the Huffington Post was born as an alternative to Drudge. And now we had a completely polarized media landscape. And ultimately, Donald Trump would be the beneficiary of that climate. In the 3 decades since Trump first entered the political scene, the media and the GOP leadership have undergone systemic change. A polarized media completely supplanted the role of party leaders. No longer was the way for advancement to pay your dues and earn seniority. Now it was simply to say something incendiary and become a fundraising magnet. A great example, Republican Joe Wilson shouting, "You lie," at President Obama in a 2009 joint session of Congress, and then in the ensuing 24 hours, he raised $1 million. By the time that Donald Trump descended the escalator at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy, an audience had already been preconditioned for the Howard Beale of the 2016 cycle. Do you remember the movie? 1976. Peter Finch earned an Oscar playing a fictitious newscaster named Howard Beale who arrives at his studio late one night, and he's wet and he's disheveled and he's wearing a trench coat. He nevertheless goes on television and he tells the viewers that he's mad as hell and not going to take it anymore. Well, Donald Trump was able to marshal primary and caucus viewers in the same way that Beale was able to get his viewers to go to the window. I remember being on CNN for each of those primary and caucus election nights, and if you saw us when we weren't on camera, maybe in the periphery, and our faces were buried in laptops, I can tell you that we were looking at exit data from Edison Media Research. So this was data based on individuals who had just cast their ballot. And what was stunning throughout primary season, and it escalated as the season progressed, were how many on the Republican side said that they were angry at the federal government. And equally interesting was how many of them Donald Trump was winning. So the very first night, the Iowa caucus, a full 42% of voters who turned out in the Republican caucus said they were angry at the federal government. I think an additional 30% said they were dissatisfied. Trump won 30% of them at a time when he had a dozen opponents. New Hampshire, 39% of voters said they were angry. Trump won 44% of them. By the time they got to Florida, 40% said they were angry, and Donald Trump was winning 59% of those angry voters. In primary season, my thesis is this: Donald Trump was a beneficiary of the loudest voices incited over the years by the conservative media, muting all others. To his supporters, his bona fides as the father of birtherism were more significant than his lack of experience. There were other contributing factors, I think, to his rise in primary season and the rise of polarization. Money's a factor. Social media is a factor. People grow beer muscles and say things that they would never say with their thumbs if you could see their faces. I know from my Facebook page. Geography is a factor. Self-sorting is a factor. But I don't believe that Donald Trump would ever have gotten as far as he did without a climate that was 30 years in the making. He was the nation's first nominee to mirror the talk radio, Fox News, Drudge Report, Breitbart view of the world, even though some of those media mouthpieces ultimately turned against him. And that was what propelled him to primary victory against a field of much more experienced hands. When, after his crowning at the Republican convention in Cleveland, he fired his second campaign manager and then hired Breitbart's executive chairman, Steve Bannon, the process had come full circle. Now the transformation of our political leadership was complete. Men with microphones were now in charge of at least one party. He then won the general election after benefiting from a confluence of factors. First, he fostered and then seized upon distrust in the mainstream media. At the same time, he accentuated Hillary Clinton's negatives. And I think both his attacks on the media and his attacks on her were made much more easy. The road had been paved for him to do that because of the way that talk radio in particular had beat up on both the mainstream media and the Clintons for the last 2 decades plus. By Election Day, 61% said that she was not honest and trustworthy. Third, he benefited from an unenthused Democratic base. 61% of eligible voters came out in 2008, the first Obama election. 61% of eligible voters. That number dipped to 58% 4 years later, the Obama re-election. It was only 55% in this cycle. And who didn't come out to the extent they'd come out before? Hispanics, unmarried women, Asians, millennials, African Americans, all down in comparison to the last few cycles. Bottom line is, she couldn't hold the Obama coalition, especially where the most desired candidate quality in this election was change, or so said 39%. Only 21% said they were most interested in finding experience. And he won those change voters, as he would say, bigly. Fourth, he breached the big blue wall. I'm sure you heard a lot of conversation about the big blue wall, those 18 states plus Washington, D.C., that had gone Democratic for the last 6 cycles and totaled 242 electoral votes. Well, he did so by winning Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And education became the new cultural divide. This is a ranking of every state in the country, plus the District of Columbia, according to the percentage of residents with an advanced degree. In black is the national average. Everything north of the national average is colored blue because it means that was a Hillary state. Everything south, the red, with 3 exceptions, went for Trump. So there was a direct correlation in this election between one's level of education and the way in which they voted for president. You've heard a lot about the educational divide, but the way that I think the 2016 general election should be best characterized is as a rural rebellion, or more simply, Cracker Barrel versus Whole Foods. David Wasserman from the Cook Political Report deserves a tip of the hat for these findings. The GOP strength today is rural. The Democratic strength is urban and suburban, that initial ring of suburbia. It hasn't always been like this, but it is now. The nation has about 3,100 counties. And as of the election, there were 412 Whole Foods, 642 Cracker Barrels. They overlap only in 90 counties. Interestingly, the closest proximity of a Whole Foods and a Cracker Barrel in the entire country is right here in Plymouth Meeting. They build in different areas, they reach different markets. I'm convinced that their marketing plan, their development plan, I should say, is in part predicated on all of this political data that I'm sharing. Well, here's the kicker. Donald Trump won 76% of counties with a Cracker Barrel and only 22% of counties with a Whole Foods, a gap of 54%. Now, for a frame of reference, in 1992, when Bill Clinton was elected, in those same counties that today have a Cracker Barrel or Whole Foods, so we're keeping apples to apples, we're now going back to the same counties and saying, hey, what was the size of that divide when Clinton was elected? It was only 19%. When Clinton is reelected, it's 23%. When W is elected, it's 31%. His reelection, 39%. Obama, it's 43%, 46%. And all of a sudden, it's 54%, meaning that this year represents the largest expansion of the Cracker Barrel Whole Foods gap that exists in the country. Hillary had won Cracker Barrel territory against Obama in 2008 in that primary, but Democrats that cycle were shopping for their nominee at Whole Foods. This cycle, she did a lot of rallies in big cities. You remember, of course, the night before when she came to Philadelphia and had President Obama and Bruce Springsteen and Bon Jovi. But I think to her detriment, she didn't roll out any bus tours in Cracker Barrel country. You know, there were no tours of mid-market towns like Erie or Saginaw, Michigan, or Toledo, Ohio. She should have concentrated on traditional Democratic voters, and she didn't, and I think that cost her. Instead, she spent too much time in Whole Foods trying to woo voters who disliked her and ultimately returned to the Republican fold. In the 2016 primary, Donald Trump ran a Cracker Barrel strategy. And the problem for the John Kasichs of the world is that there just aren't enough Whole Foods Republicans left in the party. And then in the general, he doubled down on that same strategy. And so here's what we're left with. The Democratic candidate for president has now won the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 elections. But for the second time in very recent history, the candidate with the most votes lost. And I think this requires a deeper understanding of the rural vote and how it holds power in the country. Frankly, just as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison probably envisioned. To think of it this way, we all know that Senate allocation rewards small states because we apply equally the 2 senators per state so that Wyoming and California are equal in this regard. But often overlooked is that the House has its own rural bias. And here's how. This is a map of how the nation just voted for president. Red, Republican, blue, Democratic. You can see that the GOP vote is distributed all across the country. The Democratic vote is concentrated in cities and much more on the coasts. So the Democratic Party can win 50% of the congressional votes that are cast, but still hold fewer than 50% of the House seat. And then the Electoral College allocates according to a state's total of House and Senate representatives, so that those 2 Senate representatives, 2 per state, in combination with a heavy concentration of the Democratic vote and that diffuse nature of the GOP vote, gives a disproportionate rural edge to the Republican Party in the Electoral College. Here then is my bottom line, and then I'd be thrilled to take some of your comments or your questions. I don't think that Donald Trump would have been successful had he run 30 years ago when he first went to Portsmouth to the Rotary Club at Yoakum. But his timing was impeccable. He became our nation's 45th president by harnessing a media climate that developed as he was building his fortune. As I like to say, I have been paying close attention for 36 years. I have never seen a presidential election like this one, and I am hoping never to do so again. Thank you for your attention. Let's take some comments. I always need the icebreaker. So who will be, there's my icebreaker, thank you. Hard for me to see you, so wait for the microphone and.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments this morning. I'm just curious what you think of the recent kind of recount with Jill Stein and the money raised and that process, just what your thoughts of it are.
I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I think that it's a lot of Clinton supporters living vicariously through their newfound love for Jill Stein. I take note of the fact that she raised more money for the recount than she did for her entire campaign when she was running for president. There's a mathematician from the University of Michigan who has noted, I mean, this is what it's all premised on, and there's been so much coverage of it, and yet not a lot of analysis on this. But the basic premise is that she performed poorly in certain areas with electronic ballots in comparison to those same type of areas where the balloting was done by paper. So there's no direct evidence of any fraud that I'm aware of, and I think I'm up to speed on it. But they want to pursue that and see if there could be some explanation for it. There's a story in the Washington Post which I think is really well done. It's an essay, and I have a mind blank. I can't think of the name of the guy who wrote it. But it talks about how perhaps the greatest issue of this cycle is one that we're just not spending a lot of time discussing, and that is the whole hand of Russia in our election. The fact that WikiLeaks did publish all that information from John Podesta's private email account, that the DNC was hacked back, if you remember, in the whole Debbie Wasserman-Schultz kerfuffle. And yet it seems like if we're satisfied with the election because we were for Trump, then we're not going to make a big deal out of it. And as to why the Democrats haven't made a bigger deal out of it, I think it's probably because they're embarrassed about some of the contents of those emails. But I agree with the premise of it, which is to say that I think something very serious just took place in terms of foreign intervention in our election. I'm not crying sour grapes for Hillary. I just think that it's something that we as Americans need to pay closer attention to. And so the logic goes, if they were able to hack into the accounts of the DNC and Podesta, might they have done something nefarious with those voting machines in electronic areas? I'm happy that they're doing it. I know that Donald Trump is very dissatisfied about it, and my happiness is not because I'm rooting for Hillary or I'm rooting for Jill Stein, but I'm rooting against 2 years from now a documentary that comes out that looks convincing and becomes internet lore that convinces Americans that something dirty really did take place. Let's pursue it. Let's see what's up, if anything, and then let's move on with a clear slate. I see a gentleman way in the back. Here we come.
Mr. Smerconish, I've heard you speak before, and in particular talk about the polarization that's taken place over the last couple of decades. You're not really in a position to tell the Democratic Party what they need to do to fix the situation for the Democrats, but I'd be interested in your perspective on what needs to change in the media such that it changes to a more balanced approach. There's so much money. Media is a business, and the strategy of Fox and others, whether right or left, is fundamentally on making money, and that business strategy has worked.
My argument would have been a hell of a lot easier to make if 3.5 weeks ago the election had turned out differently. I published a column that was sort of embarrassing in retrospect in the Enquirer on the Sunday before the election, which was my post-mortem, and how the Republican Party needed to right itself. And at the top of my list was promoting this idea of recognition that, to your point, the individuals who do what I do for a living have a different objective than the parties. The Republican Party exists for one purpose, and so does the Democratic Party, to win elections. That is not the goal of the media forces that I've been describing. Their goal is to attract ears and eyes and computer clicks, and to stir that pot and keep you coming back for more without any focus toward whether we're producing good governance. But it's going to be hard now. If Donald Trump had lost the election, then I could more easily have stood here and said, okay, here's what the GOP needs to do. Be less reliant on some of those more extreme news sources. But he won. And of all things, instead of me being able to stand here and say there needs to be less reliance on Breitbart, you've now got, as a senior advisor in the White House, the executive who was running Breitbart ever since the namesake passed away. So it's not going to happen anytime soon. I also thought that there was a possibility that if Trump lost, he would start Trump TV, and that maybe some of the more ideologically driven personalities would gravitate toward his network, leaving room for more independent conservatives like a Megyn Kelly, like a Shepard Smith, like a Chris Wallace, who I think did a terrific job in the final debate in Las Vegas, that would then become the new face of the Republican Party through Fox News. But that didn't materialize. And so I think it's going to stay nasty for a while. And there's also the added factor, and I'm not laying this off on the right, I'm laying this off on social media generally, but we have a real problem with fake news in this country. I'll bet we've all had the experience, maybe recently at the Thanksgiving table, with someone who wanted to share with you a story that they were absolutely convinced was gospel when in fact it's bogus. The media today is whatever you want it to be. Whatever you're looking for, you can find. The shame is that we've never had so much choice, and yet so few among us seem to be exercising it. I know so many who live in a bubble that is NPR and Huffington Post and MSNBC. And then likewise, there are others that I know who are existing only on a diet of the ones that I referenced in the course of my remarks. Short answer is people need to change the channel more often. Yes, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Other side.
There we go.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for your comments, and I think you did a great job in weaving the story about how many layers there are and it taking place over 20 to 30 years to set up this environment. So my question is, there's some people who think that Trump is bright, some people think he's not bright. How much do you think this is right place, right time for him, and how much did he kind of read the tea leaves and take advantage of it?
Well, that's a great question. I think he has a great ear. I think he really has a good ear, particularly for the populist. I'll give you a great example. We get consumed with what he's tweeting, and we're focused on what those tweets say and not looking at more significant things that are then transpiring. Two examples come to mind. So Governor Pence goes to Hamilton, and the cast come out at the end. You saw the footage, and the cast come out at the end, and they deliver a lecture of sorts. By the way, I was with Mike Pence on that. Pence was a gentleman. He said he didn't take umbrage at it. I thought it was inappropriate. Most of my radio listeners disagreed with me. But Donald Trump engaged in a battle with the Hamilton cast. And so, everybody had an opinion about that. It was a very straightforward issue, very simplistic. It reminds me of, I like to say that Watergate was something that brought down a presidency because we all understood it. There was a burglary. We don't want somebody ripping us off, breaking into our house. That's a bad thing. Whitewater? What was Whitewater? It was a very confusing land transaction on the watch of the Clintons. It never really stuck. Hamilton, easy issue. You were either for or against Mike Pence being there and being reprimanded by the cast. But while that debate was taking place and everybody was weighing in and it led all the news, Mike Flynn, Lieutenant General Flynn, was appointed as the National Security Advisor for Donald Trump. And never fully aired, at least to my satisfaction, was that the National Security Advisor is one who believes that Islam is an ideology and not a religion. And I worry about that mindset becoming a recruitment poster for ISIS. And now, in the last 24 hours, what just happened? A college, no disrespect, I had never heard of this school. It's in New Hampshire, I know that, where students were taking down flags and someone burned a flag, and Donald Trump tweeted yesterday that he thinks that there should be loss of citizenship or a punishment of a year, I think he said, in jail for somebody who burns a flag. And I read in very early this morning, and I was amazed at how much of the news cycle is now consumed with the flag burning issue, even though the Supreme Court of the United States has already weighed in and said, if you want to burn a flag, you can burn a flag. And yet the appointments continue that he is making, and because it requires more time and attention, they don't get the focus. So it's a very superficial process and to your question, I think he gets all of this. Because by simply sitting there and sending out a tweet, he is controlling the dialogue. I'll say one final thing that you didn't ask me about, and that is, so how will he govern? I had hoped that what we would see is a compromiser in chief. I mean, I may be wrong. I don't believe that he is a doctrinaire, ideological conservative. If he is, he just became one in the last 18 months. I mean, I think that the Donald Trump at his core is the 2 Corinthians Donald Trump. The guy who went to Liberty University with Falwell Jr. and said, well, we all love 2 Corinthians, and he misspoke in terms of his reference. Some saw that as a patronizing statement. I took it as a glass half full in terms of, here's a guy who's just trying to close a deal. And that's really not who he is. And maybe he won't govern in that manner. Okay, so now we look at the cabinet, and the cabinet is 3/4 constituted, and there are a couple of exceptions there. It's a very establishment-oriented cabinet. I could see a number of the individuals who are in Trump's cabinet having served in somebody else's cabinet had they won the election, with a couple of exceptions. Bannon is an exception, Flynn is an exception, but Sessions is a hardline guy. Pompeo, the head of the CIA, is a hardline guy. And lest someone should ask me about this whole Secretary of State issue, I have no idea what's going on with Mitt Romney. I mean, how do you go to dinner at Jean-Georges last night and eat frog legs with Mitt Romney and then not have him as your Secretary of State? That would be so embarrassing. I can't imagine that Trump is really just toying with him like that. On the other hand, no one was more loyal to Donald Trump than Rudy Giuliani. Is he going to cast aside Rudy and go instead for a guy who called him a con? I don't know. But every day is a different drama, and for all the wrong reasons, it's great for someone who does what I do for a living. A final question or comment?
Yes. Yeah, over here. Michael, I was wondering, as a former Comcaster, how Brian Roberts and Steve Burke let you slip over to CNN, and if you could comment on that at all.
So here's the true answer. I was never a good fit at MSNBC. My sole job there for 5 years was to guest host Hardball when Chris Matthews would be on vacation. And it was a really interesting time in my life because my own politics were evolving. I had been a doctrinaire Republican for 30 straight years. I dropped out of the Republican Party because a lot of the social changes that were taking place in the party. And I was also trying to find my way in this environment. You know, imagine if you did what I do for a living, you have to decide, well, how am I going to compete? The easiest way for me to compete in this environment is to read the talking points and go along. But I didn't believe the talking points. And for 5 years while I was guest hosting Hardball for Chris Matthews, the same 5 years, Bill O'Reilly had a syndicated radio show on 500 stations across the country. And when he would vacation, I was his guest host. And there were days where I would guest host O'Reilly's radio show in the afternoon and leave at about, 57 or 58th and 6th Avenue and walk 2 blocks north to 30 Rock and guest host Hardball. On the same day, I would have hosted O'Reilly's show and Matthew's show. I would joke that I wasn't sure if I was going to get shot in the back or shot in the chest as I went from one to the other. So MSNBC was good to me in that role. And you've asked a direct question, I'll give you a direct answer. The president was and is Phil Griffin. And he knew that I had an itch. I wanted a show of my own. And one day he said to me, Smirk, we are young, liberal, and nerdy. And you are none of the above. And you're not getting a show here. You can guest host Hardball for as long as you're willing. I have you under contract, and if someone else wants you and you want out, I'll let you out. But you know, you never know, a boss who says that, are they really going to honor that word? And Jeff Zucker took over CNN and offered me a program of my own. And when I went back to Phil Griffin, he wished me Godspeed. So I never had any, I know all the other personalities that you named, but I never had any dealings with any of them about my own career. Hey, I want to leave you with the thoughts of 2 deep thinkers whose words I have long admired, Marx and Lenin. No, not those 2. Groucho said, politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies. And John said, will the people in the cheaper seats clap your hands and the rest of you just rattle your jewelry? Thank you very much.